Hey everyone, welcome. Just letting people in here. Just be a moment as people are joining us. Thank you all so much for being with us today. You're welcome to have your cameras on if you want. We are recording. This is a free program, so we'll keep this recording on MOFAD's YouTube channel. So just keep that in mind if you have any feelings about having your camera on or off in terms of the archive of this, but you are more than welcome to keep your cameras on. It's always nice to see people's faces in these virtual days. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in New York City, wherever you are, whatever time it is. Thank you for joining us. It's great to see you. I hope some of you are maybe having some lunch with us. My name is Sari Kamen. I'm the Public Programs Director of MOFAD, Museum of Food and Drink. We are based in New York City. We have an exhibition open in New York City at the Africa Center, which is in Harlem. It's called African/American, Making the Nation's Table. So if you are in New York or coming to New York at some point this summer, I would love to see you there. And if you're not, I'm so glad that you can be with us virtually. We also do programs with the Africa Center that happen virtually as well. So make sure you are signed up for MOFAD's newsletter so you can find out how to join us for those programs. So we have just an hour, so I want to get started today because we have a very robust, incredible group of panelists to talk about what's happening with the Ukraine war and how it is impacting our global food supply and global food system. So I'm going to call on our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then I'll turn things over to Fabio Pierres, who's our moderator for today. So why don't we start with Michael Puma, because on the screen you're next to me.
Great. Thanks for inviting me to be here. My name is Michael Puma. I'm a director of the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University, working on global food security and also modeling of refugee movement. Thank
you. Chef Pierre Cham.
I'm Pierre Cham. I'm a chef and cookbook author and also a social entrepreneur.
Indeed. Diana, why don't you go next? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diana Mincita. I'm an associate professor of sociology at the City University of New York. My accent is Lithuanian, so I bring in some of the East European Baltic perspective in addition to being an academic.
Wonderful. And then we have Brian from Sweden.
Hello, thank you for the invitation. I'm actually from the United States, just lived in Sweden a long time. And I'm an assistant professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, where I study agrarian change in Ukraine and also Europe in general, Sweden and the Nordic countries.
Wonderful. Alicia Liu.
Hi, my name is Olasha Liu. I'm the chef at Veselka. It's a restaurant in New York City. It's a Ukrainian restaurant in the East Village. I'm a first-generation Ukrainian, and I feel so honored to be part of this discussion group with all you people. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Fabio. Just quickly, there'll be some time for Q&A, which you can use the chat function for at the end. And Fabio will let you know when we're moving on to that. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Fabio.
Thank you, Sari. Hello, everybody. So let's get started. We have a lot of material to cover. So the idea more or less is, at least in this first part of the conversation, we'll start thinking about Ukraine and then Eastern Europe and then the world. So I'll start asking questions with that. But I think a good introduction, since many of us are here in the US, is I would ask Alicia precisely how has it been since the beginning of the war in an Ukrainian restaurant, and a very visible one here in New York City? What has been the changes in the perception of Ukrainian food? Has it changed for you at the restaurant?
Well, we were pleasantly surprised how many people wanted to immediately help us, help Ukraine, I should say. In 2014, when Russia invaded Eastern Ukraine, we felt like we were alone, but this time around, immediately people joined board, came to the restaurant and gave us donations and wanted to purchase food. And we started the incentive of Bosch for Ukraine. And all those proceeds of those sales are going to Ukrainian causes. So at one point we were inundated with people trying to come to the restaurant and really wanted to join and be part of the conversation of helping Ukraine. And that's incredible. And we've been able to then earmark and be advocates for Ukraine, as well as earmark certain funds for certain places. And one of the things we do is we support some restaurants in Ukraine who've had to shift from being restaurants, and now they provide food for people, so that people can come to the restaurants and take their packaged food out. And we also support people who are individually who can't work, who have changed their business models to prepare food to give to elderly people. So there's a lot of hands-on work and there's a lot of group work. And yeah.
Well, thank you. This is a great way to start. I mean, it's an emergency, and the work you guys are doing is quite amazing. Thank you from everybody. So let's start looking at what's happening in Ukraine. We know that there's been an attack starting at the end of February, so it's almost been 3 months. And since this is a food-centered conversation, let's try to understand what are the consequences of what's happening in Ukraine. Maybe I'll start with Brian. If you could tell us a little bit, what's been the impact on Ukrainian farmers, both small farmers and agribusiness? What sort of challenges they are facing now, and what are the maybe longer term impacts with what's happening?
Okay. Well, from what I can see, and people I've talked to, and what I've read, production in Ukraine, and here I'm mostly talking about agribusiness, is going to be substantially impacted by the war. And there's several bits of it. I'll try to keep the answer short. I mean, one is production itself, and there are different estimates. And I spoke to an agronomist who said that a lot of these estimates are assumptions stacked upon assumptions. It's hard to know. The closer you get to the front line, the more agriculture is impacted. That's kind of logical, I guess. So production itself will be impacted. You know, it may be something like 70% of normal production, or, you know, it goes up and down every year anyway. Maybe as bad as 50% of normal production. Aside from that, Ukraine sort of has its reputation of being the breadbasket of Europe or the breadbasket of the world. And so export will be substantially affected. The main exports mainly go through the port cities, which are blockaded now, so no export can leave. There is a small amount of exports that can leave by rail or truck through the western border, and this is being increased, but it's increased. And I think I read that it's even doubled, but from a very small level. So there's the worry that even what is produced won't be able to leave the country. And I think the biggest challenges are the export is one, and again, talking about agribusiness, export, fuel, although apparently Ukraine is now getting fuel through Moldova, but fuel is a concern. And then Ukraine used to import a lot of fertilizer from Russia and Belarus, and those supplies, for obvious reasons, aren't able to. It imported a lot of fertilizer from other places as well, but Russia and Belarus were a big source. And then, in terms of long-term impact on agribusiness, if this year goes badly, then they have constrained finances for next year. So, and there's been infrastructure damage, roads, silos, and things like that also present a challenge. The small scale production, I don't know so much about. My guess is, and maybe someone else knows something or can say, I think that the sort of the household producers are relatively more resilient. A lot of them do buy more, like buy seed to use for planting vegetables and things like that. But my guess is that they're relatively more resilient. There have been some solidarity initiatives as well to provide sort of households with seeds and stuff to plant. So that's trying to keep the answer short. That's.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So we start having an idea of what's happening within the country. I would move to Diana. She's from Lithuania, and she works on Lithuania, but also Eastern Europe in general. As a matter of fact, we've been working together with a set of Eastern European scholars. We're publishing a longer piece that will come out on the Journal Gastronomica, but we also wrote a little op-ed that it's on my website, and I'm going to put it in the chat. So that's the collective voice of all of us. But Diana, maybe you can tell us more about this smallhold farmers and different kind of alternative food networks that are still very much alive in that part of Europe. So what's their impact in terms of economy, in terms of sustainability, the impact, and also there's the kind of work I know you do in terms of gender.
Thank you. So Brian already mentioned that the production on the small scale farms seems to be in line with what it was before, continuing. What we need to be aware of is that breaking of the infrastructures and people moving around so much that we have so many displaced persons moving to the western part of Ukraine and moving into Eastern Europe, that it really transformed the entire food supply chain system across the region. And just to give a perspective, we often told that the humanitarian crisis and the refugee crisis is approaching what it was in after World War II. But in fact, if you combine the displaced persons in Western Ukraine with refugees, it really is already surpassing what we were seeing in during World War II. And that means that at the time there was kind of more international support and ways to help. Right now, all of this falls on the shoulders of some of the poorest members of the European Union, not to speak on Ukraine, where in Western areas, rents have tripled, quadrupled, and tax rents and tickets to travel, etc., has become really, really strained. So what is happening there is that the fundamental challenge for this region is that a lot of local food production and regional food production depends on smaller scale producers who are growing food as opposed to commodity production. For example, they're growing vegetables, they'll grow tubers, potatoes, versus commodity production of corn and cotton, for example. So these producers are facing high prices for gas. For example, in Lithuania today, gas is $7 per gallon, which is good because it's down from $7.40 per gallon. And if you think about the country that has an average income of $30,000 versus 67 in the United States, you can imagine just how expensive things are. So if somebody is living in the remote area, they still need to get supplies, they still need to sell their food, they still need to use the transportation. Of course, fertilizer prices have increased by 30% at the beginning of this year, and with Russia taking 14% of the entire fertilizer market away, it means that anybody who's putting any chemical inputs will be really at a high strained enormously. So to add to this issue is we need to understand that East European markets, alternative food systems, smallholder farmers, tend to be headed these households by women. And that's the case not only in Eastern Europe, that's the case across the world, especially in Africa, where in sub-Saharan Africa, where women tend to be the face of smallholder agriculture, but also sustainable agriculture as it is here in the United States. Women are 3 times more likely to be organic producers, sustainable producers, and they are really the face of this alternative food economy that is helping to mediate these climate change and helping to bring in low input restorative kind of practices, food seed sharing, etc. So because women are involved in this, what's considered more niche economy everywhere around the world, they tend to have less access to capital. They have lower social capital. That means they are not plugged in networks that provide all kinds of knowledge, technology sharing, and they are also very often are paid significantly lower price for their products. So keeping in mind that women tend to care for the elderly and the kids, if we do not support these women's smallholder agriculture, we will have this really rippling effects, negative effects of food insecurity for children and elderly. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about this global food security. We need to also understand that insecurity is unevenly distributed across different groups and depends on rural versus urban, gender ways, and age in particular as well. So I think I can stop here, but we can definitely think a lot about on the global scale that also these smallholder farmers are occupying worldwide 12% of land, and they are producing, in the most conservative way calculations, 32% of all food grown there. So if we cannot figure out how to ensure that not only the major commodity producers are able to produce and export food, but also how we're going to support these local regional food systems, we're in for a very complicated effects of crisis. And if we remember, the last spikes from food prices in the 2010s led to the Arab Spring and all kinds of political consequences of that. So I guess I will stop on this end and we can go back.
So this is also a good segue to go into, sort of the global ripple effect. Before we do that, I would also like to underline that, the gender aspect, it's made worse also by the fact that now men are required to join the army. And so they are not actually working in the fields at a time where, it's important to be there to take care of the land, to sow the new summer and fall crops. So the gender aspect, it's even more, it's even stronger than it is normally, as Diana was pointing out. We'll maybe leave the political issues in Eastern Europe for later, but those are also huge. I will move on to Michael. By the way, if you guys have not read it, Michael wrote an op-ed on the New York Times. I strongly recommend it. But can you start helping us understand more, what are the effects on the global scale? Where do we start from? And also, I know you do specific works on data. If you can share with us some of that.
Sure. Yeah, I think the place to start with is to understand that the global food system was in sort of a fragile state. If you think about the prevalence of hunger around the world, prior to the conflict, the World Food Program estimated about 811 million people go to bed hungry every night. So we were sort of in a very difficult circumstance. And in fact, that another World Food Program estimate is that the number of people facing acute food insecurity has doubled from 135 million all the way up to 270 6 million. And so this is prior to any of the disruptions that we're hearing about that Brian and Diana mentioned in terms of fertilizer production and trade, in terms of production of food coming from Ukraine. So it turns out Ukraine and Russia combined are major exporters of wheat, of sunflower oil. And as a result, we're seeing increases in commodity prices around the world for a variety of key commodities. We saw estimates recently. A Financial Times article was quite good. I think it was last week or the week before, and they clarified the increases in wheat prices, corn, barley. These are increasing in the global markets. A little bit more concerning, I mentioned sunflower oil, that the edible food oils have increased, and this has had knock-on effects to palm oil, rapeseed oil, increasing prices in those markets. So as a result, we're seeing this pressure manifest itself in food prices at retail and restaurants, and countries that are sort of teetering on the edge of food insecurity are now facing these additional pressures. I think the point on the impacts of fertilizer markets is quite severe. Russia and Ukraine are major exporters. If we look at potassium, one of the major fertilizers coming from Russia and Belarus, actually Russia's ally, supplies huge percentages for Africa, West Africa, Central Africa, South America, and even China, India. So, there's a concern that farmers are going to have to face trade-offs in terms of their decisions on what fertilizers to use, how much, and this could affect global production. The other point that I'll just make and wrap it up there is the impact on global trade. And this is a key issue that we're very concerned about. The prior disruptions that we saw in 2008 and 2011, these were primarily disruptions in terms of food prices. As a result, countries imposed trade restrictions, export restrictions. And this is somewhat the worst case scenario that we could see if multiple countries start imposing trade restrictions, which has can have a domino effect throughout the global market. So that's the biggest concern at the moment. I think we have to encourage countries to collaborate and to coordinate their responses and to avoid these sort of bigger interventions in the global markets. So I'll leave it there.
No, the points you make, looking back at 2008, 2011, I think it's very important. Looking back then, we can also think maybe what will be the impact in terms of speculation on the commodity markets. Already the price of the wheat futures are extremely high. So it's not just a problem for now, it's a problem for the future. Russia now, it cannot export oil the way it used to do before. Will there be a push towards biofuels again? And producing biofuels means that you divert land from producing food and feed to fuel. So there is a whole set of issues that can impact this, and we see them in play in 2008, 2011. So for economists and political scientists, this is a moment where everybody's trying to understand where this is going. But this brings me then to Pierre. Pierre, you're from Senegal and you still have strong roots there. And as a matter of fact, you have a business there. We were talking about vegetable oils, sunflower oils, and you have a direct experience, if I understand correctly, on the impact of the reduction of oil availability on the global market. Pierre, I think he might be frozen.
Yeah, he might be frozen.
Okay.
Let me try.
I looked at him, I was like, okay, he's not even there is something. All right, maybe he will leave and then come back.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're almost done with the first sort of beginning of this conversation. We'll go on a little longer, and then, you know, at 1:15 New York Times, we will start a Q&A session. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I see already we have questions from Lee Ullman. Sari will make sure that we don't miss questions, and we'll take them after we finish this first round of conversation. I see that Pierre has joined us again.
What happened?
There you go. Here you are. We missed you. It's like, where's Pierre?
But as soon as he started introducing me, I guess the internet got cut off. So it was interesting omen here. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate being here, and really, I'm just gonna piggyback on everybody's comments. You know, you guys said everything really about the danger of this situation. It really, this war in Ukraine is really highlighting the weaknesses of our food system. Really, you know, the fact that our global food system is relying on 4 crops, and that those 4 crops, rice, corn, wheat, and soy, are like concentrated. The reserves of it are concentrated in regions of the world, and when there's a crisis, the whole world is affected. And this crisis is one of them. You mentioned the 2008. The pandemic is another one. Every single crisis is having a ripple effect and affecting the whole world. And as Michael said, you know, the numbers are telling. The poverty, the hunger in the world is growing. Particularly in Africa, we are just interesting because we find ourselves in this paradox. We are net importers of food. You know, we, in my part of West Africa, which was colonized by French, we have come to rely on wheat and to eat baguette breads every day in Senegal and many other countries in Africa. And now wheat is inaccessible, and that creates social crisis. And that's just one example, you know, but hunger is rising. And now this crisis, this war, I believe could be an opportunity, because every crisis comes with big opportunities. And this is another one, to rethink our food system. Why are we relying on 4 crops when there is over 7,000 edible plants in the world? Why is our food system limiting us to those 4 crops? How come? I mean, it's just common sense for everyone. When we investing, we diversifying our food, our investment portfolio. Why aren't we doing it for our world foods portfolio? Those are the questions I think that are important to think about, because those crises will keep on coming. You know, 2008 was here, it went. We haven't learned from it. We're still stuck in relying on getting our wheat from this part of the world, Russia and Ukraine, that has 1/3 of the wheat supply. That will be the same with corn. The corn supply is in 4 countries in the world, and so on and so forth. We cannot live a sustainable world, a sustainable food system when we're going to be 10 billion people on this planet. How are we going to feed ourselves? I think Diana made a good point. Figure out a way to support small farming communities, particularly women, because they have the answer. Small farming communities that are also growing those underutilized crops, because those underutilized crops are the solution to our food security. So basically, that's unless we seriously figure out a way to tackle this, and that's going to take a work of, you know, it's going to start with policymakers, and obviously researchers have to be involved, because there's lots of research that needs to be done, and there's not enough research that's being done, especially with Africa. And that's really unfortunate, because Africa is going to feed the planet. Africa has 60% of the world's arable land. Let me repeat that, 60% of the world's arable land. So how come we are not focusing on those crops that are indigenous to those regions? The little research that's being done on those crops is already proving that those crops are highly nutritious. Not only they're nutritious, they're also very resilient. Now we're talking about climate change. Those crops have been around for thousands of years, and they are going through all kinds of of climate crisis, and they're still here with like lots of nutrition potential, and they can also bring economic opportunities for those regions, those small farming communities. Again, mostly are women. Those crops are here because women have made sure to keep growing them and bringing them to feed their own family. But those crops can go beyond that. They can go beyond being just subsistence crop. They can become world-class crop. They can be part of supplying the food, the consumers with a diversified diet, which is very important, because many of the diseases that we are having are just because of the lack of diversity in our diet. All those chronic diseases are directly connected with our diet. Food is medicine. This is not just a slogan, this is a reality. So we have to think about it this way. I think it's very important. And this crisis in Ukraine is another opportunity to really face it, because another crisis is gonna come, and I'm afraid that one could be the one that really could be disruptive to a point of no return.
And Pierre, I know that you were co-signatory of a piece, sort of a position piece on nature. If you want to share it on the chat so people can read it, I think it's very well done, short, but to the point. But before we continue, Pierre, you're also an entrepreneur, as you said, and you have a product, and the vegetable oil hits your business somehow. I think it's interesting to think that, to understand how complicated these connections are. Would you mind briefly tell us what's happening with that?
Yeah, my company is called Yoli, and early on, I always wanted to unlock the potential of crops in Africa. So I work with small farmers in Africa and identify underutilized crops. Our champion crop is called fonio. It's an ancient grain that's been cultivated for 5,000 years. Very nutritious, it's gluten-free. It grows in poor soil because Senegal is located in an area called the Sahel, which is south of the Sahara Desert. Not much grows there, and fonio happens to thrive there. So not only it thrives there, but it regenerates the soil because it has deep roots that add nutrients to the soil. So with my company, Yoli, we decided to figure out a way to bring it to the market. And we started in 2017, and today we are distributed across the US. We have our brand Yoli with different fonio products, and we're about to add other crops like bambara beans, crops that were grown in rotation with fonio, because it's important to not focus in one crop, otherwise we get back to that system of monoculture, which is what we need to stay away from. So that was the vision with the company, and I'm happy to say that we are growing, and we are now about to build a mill that will really unlock the bottleneck, because that mill will really give us the potential to make that grain accessible not only to retailers in supermarkets, but also to food companies that have the biggest problem. They are considered the biggest culprit, but they don't have access to these crops. But now they could use flour of fonio of other crops, flour of bambara beans, and adding them to their products. Imagine Kellogg's or Nestle adding those flour into their product. That will really have a great impact, but that will also make the supply chain for those products to be more accessible. So that's a solution. That's a model of development, and that's a solution as well. So that's what we're doing with. And at one point though, we just started fonio chips, right? And those fonio chips are made with sunflower oil, and we have a crisis now. Our sunflower oil is coming from Ukraine. Another way to highlight it. So now we're having a crisis because we have to figure out where to get the oil to make those fonio chips. So that's our new product.
Yeah, and I mean the consequences, the political consequences, are going to be huge about that. But before we go into this, I would go back to Alicia. Have you seen a difference in trying to get Ukrainian products, or were you already replacing products imported from Ukraine with local products in your restaurant? How is the business reacting to what's happening?
Well, the restaurant models, the way they work, you always have to have a plan if you can't get your regular products. So it wasn't till, after 1991, when Ukraine became an independent nation, that's when we started incorporating Ukrainian products. But the restaurant model is, if you can't get one thing, you always have to have something else. You know, you have to have another provider for this. So that's why we're not so dependent. We love using Ukrainian products, but we can't be dependent on it because it's not the restaurant business model. And we just follow regular restaurant business models. We're not, you know, reinventing the wheel in that. When the war started, we knew that sunflower oil we can't get, but years ago, because we wanted to be a sustainable restaurant, going back to what Diana has said and Pierre said, being a sustainable business, we started sourcing our sunflower oil from upstate New York in the Catskills in Poughkeepsie. There's a wonderful farm there. So that's how we offset, you know, we want that flavor, we want that authenticness in our food, but we can't always you know, depend on imports. And, you know, I just wanted to touch on what Pierre and Diana had said. It's so important about this sustainability and these small producers making foods, because this war impacts Ukrainians in Ukraine, and then it impacts Africa. It impacts the rest of Europe, where the refugees are going. So that's a conversation that I think we're going to have to continue to speak about, because in Ukraine right now, they're planting. They're not planting, as Brian had said, in full scale, because there's a war. But right now, people aren't traveling in Ukraine because they're holding back the petrol so that they can use that petrol to grow, to plant. Because they're hoping, Ukrainians are truly hoping that in harvest time at the end of this summer and the fall, that this will have been resolved and that they can continue, you know. We all hope that. We all hope that for Ukraine. So, yeah.
All do. Brian, are you aware of what some of these sort of stopgap solutions are being implemented right now at the moment? And also, since you know a little more about the system, is there any sort of silver lining in what's happening in terms of changing or improving agriculture in Ukraine, or is it just destruction across the board?
Gosh, those are good questions. I know there has been, they've reduced taxes on gasoline and has reduced taxes on diesel and gasoline and done things like that. Otherwise, I'm not so sure of like on the ground responses. I mean, one thing they're working on, for example, I just saw today that the EU is working to increase the capacity to export through the western border, and it has to do with there's very little capacity with the railroads. They have a different gauge system, so they have to be transshipped if they're going from Ukraine to Poland, and there's only limited capacity for that. I think I saw somewhere something like 6,000 wagons of grain is waiting at the border with Poland to be transferred to another train and then to be sent on. So the EU is just saw something today, an initiative to try to increase the capacity to export out of Ukraine. In terms of silver lining, one thing that worries me is I think that, or I don't, this isn't a silver lining, but it gets a little bit to the question. I think that the agribusiness in Ukraine is massive in the sense that it's these big companies, 100,000 hectares. The biggest Ukraland farming has like 600,000 hectares. Land bank, as they say. So these massive companies that they have. I mean, their bottom line will of course suffer, but some of these companies, they have access to capital. They might be able to. Some of these companies will be able to weather this crisis. I think that obviously we don't know when the war is going to end. We don't know, what the future scale of destruction will be. But I think that some of the biggest companies are probably going to be able to survive this. They have sources of capital. Diana mentioned, the importance of the small scale sort of household production for Ukraine. And that's, the statistics are hard to, statistics on this are hard to sort of, we don't know how sort of valid and reliable they are. But something like 35%, maybe 40%, maybe more of Ukrainian production still today is produced sort of in the household sector. People making food for themselves and selling surplus, and through kinship networks and friends and whatnot, extended networks, exchanging food, very important source of food. And then, as Diana mentioned, people are moving around. This massive refugee crisis. What worries me, but anyway, these people, I think, are relatively resilient. What worries me is the farmers in the middle, who, sort of a family farmer model, not like agribusiness, strictly speaking, but, maybe it's still pretty big farms, maybe 500 hectares, maybe 300 hectares. I think a lot of those farmers who that these agribusiness, they're in the cities. But these farmers like 300 hectares, they live in the communities, they live in the villages. I think a lot of them are going to suffer. It's a smaller sector of the Ukrainian sort of agrarian structure, but that's one of the things that worries me. So that's not really a silver lining. I think maybe a silver lining, as someone in Europe, is that I think Europe is going to press ahead in greening its energy sources, or I don't know, greening might be not the right word, because maybe they're going to sort of double down on nuclear power, but at least not using fossil fuels. That's a potential silver lining from this conflict.
Thank you. I see there are a few questions trickling in, so really quick answers maybe. Brian, what do you, Michael, what do you think what's happening here will do in terms of rethinking transportation and logistics? As you had mentioned, it was already hit during COVID, now this war. Do you see this bringing some change in the logistics? I don't know, redundancies or different ideas about efficiency, or the decontainerization? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there's opportunity to evaluate how food moves around the world, thinking about critical infrastructure from ports to railways to roadways, dependence upon the energy sector. We've mentioned here on the call, the dependence of transport on different forms of energy. All these things are important. So I think when we're thinking about resilience of the infrastructure, we start to think about, well, how do you deal with disruptions, and how do you reconfigure your transportation systems if there's something that you didn't anticipate? So just think back to last year, the Suez Canal. There was a big blockage there. A cargo ship blocked the Suez Canal, and people sort of scrambled. What do we do? And so I think this is the chance for sort of additional research, working with companies to sort of build resilience into the food system, not just focusing on efficiency, this just-in-time delivery of our food products, and to really reimagine how we can make things more improved and resilient.
Thank you. So before we move into the Q&A moment, and we already have a couple of questions, I would ask Alicia, but also everybody else, how can we help? If you know about organizations, if you know about actions going on, if you can tell us real briefly, or maybe put a link in the chat so everybody has access to that information, that would be great, because on this, we're so far, we also feel a little powerless. So what can we do? Alicia, something that comes to mind?
Well, at Veselka, we started that initiative. So if you buy Bosch, we have donated over $150,000 to relief funds.
Oh, wow.
But We've also partnered with World Central Kitchen. They are boots on the ground. They are providing food for people who are crossing the border. So there is not that impact on the host countries as it could be. They're in Ukraine, they're in Kharkiv, they're in the war zone. So World Central Kitchen, it's WCF.org, I'll put that in the chat. And another organization that is providing humanitarian relief is called Razum for Ukraine. Again, another organization that works directly in Ukraine to provide resources for people. And there's so many others to support. So please always verify who you donate to, because that unfortunately is a product of war as well. People take advantage of situations. So for example, Save the Children is another great organization, boots on the ground in Ukraine. Caritas, another great organization, boots on the ground, had to move their headquarters from Kyiv to Lviv, but are distributing food supplies as well as those needed supplies for those refugees, which is 90% women and children. So I will put that in the chat. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let's start with the question. We have a question from Annabelle for Diana. Why do women play a more significant role in organic farming?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The reasons are different in different cultural contexts and different economies. In the United States and Western Europe, that comes from the structural and historical marginalization of women not having enough capital to buy and be owners of large conventional agriculture. So smaller farms pieced together through several kind of formerly family relations, make it possible for them to enter into and become managers and or owners of farms. And that, because of the size, then leads them to, and also interests as well, to produce something that is more what's considered more niche, but I would say more essential for our reproduction of our society in general and the environment. Organic production. Outside of these Western economies, women tend to very often have more rights, and in some cases, and for example, historically in sub-Saharan Africa, women have been owners and have much larger representation in terms of managing land and around their households and communal land as well. In Eastern Europe also, interestingly, Eastern European women are much better positioned to own and manage farms than Western European countries. And in fact, there is very interesting tendency where there is still kind of Western European developmental agencies are coming and telling that women need to learn how to own and manage their property, which is kind of really paradoxical in terms of how they look at this backwards part of the world. But these farms are coming from kind of, they operate to an extent as an extension of the domestic household space, even they might be 100 hectares large as this, because women tend to look at them not simply as a commodity production site, but also as a site for household, diversifying their approach, and there is this kind of logic of sustainability and subsistence that you want to keep diversifying your hedging your bets, so to speak, to have different crops and different approaches, and that because of that, it requires, it's easier to do it if you get for example, in Eastern Europe, the EU subsidies for organic agriculture, and that's how they tend to go into that route as well. And even in the cases where they are not supported directly, this the system of exchanging that Brian mentioned, kind of kinship relationship, kinship-based labor arrangements, and a household as a unit of production where you do not hire somebody, but you tend to share work along these kinship lines, enable this. Just a side note, this does not mean that this is we should not romanticize this, because it can be incredibly exploitative, and the hours are grueling, and very often older women staying there because nobody else is willing to go and milk their cows 3 times a day, which is and bike to the next field, do something else. It's grueling work, but the way that gender relationships and property relationships work in these different contexts have created conditions for women kind of taking on this additional, usually not remunerated work in saving the planet and us all, I guess.
All right, thank you. Thank you. We have a question from Lee for anybody on the panel. How do you think we can incentivize producers and others in the food industry to help safeguard many of the important Ukrainian varieties we are now at risk of losing? And she continues, for example, I've been thinking about how alternative currencies might provide some opportunities. Some ideas about this. So how can we safeguard local varieties of crops in Ukraine? And on the other hand, can, technology, in this case, alternative currencies, but it could be blockchain or any form of traceability, provide opportunities? Any ideas about this? It's quite a technical question, but I think it's also interesting.
I can't comment on blockchain, but I can comment when Ukraine became independent, how many entrepreneurs came into Ukraine and saw the value of the land. So I feel that after this war, I think those same opportunities will happen. But I also think that over this time, Ukrainians have become very good at preserving their land and how to use their land. And as mentioned before, that a lot of Ukrainian households produce a lot of their own food. So it's a very interesting question. I'm very fascinated to see what will happen. That's just my thought on my personal experience.
Yeah, I think both elements are very interesting. I don't do work in Ukraine. My work is in Poland. But there I can see that, for instance, recently there's been a renewed interest in local varieties of food outside of the varieties that have been chosen, for instance, in agribusiness, because they guarantee higher yields, they're easier to mechanize, and also all of that. So I think, from what I understand from my Ukrainian friends, that was also starting in Ukraine, despite the fact that, as Brian pointed out, agribusiness constitute the vast majority of food production. But there is also lots of smallholders. But here we're talking about something a little different. Sometimes there are people that from the cities that move back to the countryside that have also this cultural interest in varieties, in production. Sometimes they don't speak the same languages as the farmers that were there before. That language in terms of culture, they all speak Polish or Ukrainian. But I think this is an interesting dynamics that it's starting. As from alternative currencies and blockchains, Lee, I see you continue here saying it could create alternative marketplaces. It could be useful. I think at this point, it's just a question of supply of materials rather than question of alternative marketplaces. There is not enough commodities, crops moving within Ukraine and leaving Ukraine. So who knows, maybe in the future. Right now, I think we're in emergency mode in a way. I had a question also for all the panelists, if you want to talk about it. What do you think will be the political repercussions of what's happening, of this food crisis that we see developing? What could be the consequence in Ukraine, but also in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and the world? There's been several mentions of, the 2011 crisis and the Arab Spring. Where do you think we're going from a political point of view? I don't know if you have any reflection on this.
Well, I could chime in. I mean, that's a huge question and so many layers.
I know it's.
But I mean, just thinking about the geopolitical dynamics at the largest scale, I mean, there's a lot of dynamics going on in terms of, I mean, just thinking about dominance in food supply chains, competition between various nations. I mean, that's it, not to call out anything, but I mean, we see for sure, we see Russia and Belarus. I mean, that they are close allies, and so we've seen statements coming from Russia, that they certainly use this to their advantage, and this is sort of what happens. And I mean, I think one of the things that we saw a call from the U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, calling for more international coordination, and I think that, thinking about, Pierre mentioned about future crises, coming down the line, I think it is an opportunity to start to build those, processes or pathways to coordinate among nations, because right now we don't have a strategy in place when some disruption comes to the forefront. So for me, I think that's an opportunity, and it has to take into account geopolitics and all of those dynamics.
I totally agree. I've just been following what's happening in Peru, for instance. The price spikes in food. It's really fueling political unrest that is threatening, a new president that was elected even less than a year ago, with the idea of bringing reform, of moving beyond Fujimori politics, and now that's crumbling. In Tunisia, all the instability is being used by the president to dissolve the parliament. So I think that this ripples will be felt in a long time. But we're almost at the end of our time, and I would like to close in a positive note, as Michael was saying. Probably this is the moment in which there are opportunities to create some sort of world thinking about these crises, about hunger, about what to do to avoid, that people end up without food. It's a question of collaboration. It's a question of rethinking economic ties, geopolitics. But if something good can come out of it, I think it would be amazing. We can only hope. So it's 1:30, so it's the end of our time. I would thank all our speakers for participating. Thank you for providing your very different point of view and experiences. I think this has made our panel extremely rich. And I would ask maybe Sari, if you want to say some final words on behalf of MOFAD.
Just thank you so much. And just to echo Fabio, thank you to all of our speakers for contributing your amazing expertise and point of view. It was really an honor to hear from all of you. And thank you for taking time in your very busy schedules. And as always, Fabio, it's such a pleasure to work with you. So thank you for your skillful moderation, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. We did record, so I'll send the link to everyone with some information about how you can stay in touch with the panelists and hopefully come to more programs. So take care, everyone. Stay safe and hope to see you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.